Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. Morning seeps into the narrow streets of Florence like ink sinking into old parchment. The first sound is the bray of a cart horse. The next, the metallic clink of shutters lifted one by one. Down a quieter lane, behind the faded sign of a quill-and lamp, the small bookshop waits, half asleep. Inside, dust drifts through tilted light, as if it remembers where it once lay. Piles of forgotten volumes lean against each other, bindings cracked like dry riverbeds. A few coins rest on the counter beside an oil lamp that hardly gives more life than a candle. Among these shadows, a child moves deliberately, careful not to wake the silence. Small hands gather strips of rough paper fallen from yesterday's mending. The scent of glue and linen thread lingers, mixed with that of rain seeping through the shutters. The father's voice, from the back room, carries the tone of someone used to talking to pages more than to people. He hums the setting line of a psalm, then clears his throat, a sound the girl knows as the start of another long day. Her world is this room, the uneven shelves, the ledger sprinkled with ink flakes, the squeak of the stool whose leg leans slightly inward. Sometimes she wonders if the whole earth is uphill, for nothing in this shop stands quite straight. Yet to her, it feels safe, as if the misaligned walls lean protectively toward one another. When she opens a book with gilt edges, the letters shimmer like tiny embers. She dreams that words might be alive but sleeping, and that by touching them gently, they might open their eyes. Outside, the Arno smells of wet stone. The girl knows this smell well. It seeps through the street whenever the air grows heavy. On rare days, a wealthy buyer comes, his boots polished, gloves folded on the counter. Her father straightens his shoulders then, hiding the cough that rattles his chest. Most of these men browse idly, quoting verses half-remembered from professors they once admired. Few read deeply. Fewer still pay honestly. The girl senses her father's discomfort, the effort it takes to balance pride with hunger, yet he never bows low, and at night he tells her that dignity, like paper, is easily torn if dampened by fear. When trade is slow, he teaches her the craft of repair, how to press fragile pages between muslin to lift stains, how to make paste from flour and vinegar until it feels smooth enough to spread on gold leaf. He lets her practice on old ledgers sold for scrap. Sometimes as they work, he smiles faintly at her mistakes. "Every tear leaves a trace," he murmurs, "but some traces are worth keeping." The child remembers those words without yet understanding their weight. Evening often ends with them by the window, watching the street lamps bloom one by one. The shops opposite sell shoes and dried herbs. From the apothecary comes the bitter scent of quinine and cloves. From the square, music drifts, an old tune played thinly on a violin, its notes carried unevenly by the wind. The father keeps time with his thumb against the windowsill. The girl, lulled by the rhythm, folds a paper crane that will never fly beyond the threshold. Her father sometimes speaks of books as if they were people. Some are honest, he says, plain, sensible, smelling of earth. Others are deceitful, dressed in gold to hide shallow thought. He warns her not to trust too quickly those who talk of art but live without kindness. She nods solemnly, not knowing yet how deeply those words will mark her. Trust, for her, is still a simple thing. A hand on her shoulder, a bowl of lentil soup, the warmth of their small fire. The winter that follows is harsh. The price of coal rises, and even the wealthy complain of scarcity. Customers stop coming. The girl notices her father writing letters at night, the handwriting trembling slightly, as if ashamed of what it must request. She learns what debt means from the tension in his jaw when he seals the envelopes. Sometimes she hears him murmuring to a portrait of her late mother, apologizing for not managing better. The candles burn shorter each week. Yet every morning he scrapes his boots clean and opens the shop as usual, as though ceremony alone could keep despair at bay. One afternoon, heavy clouds gather before the bells of Santa Croce finish tolling. The air thickens with the metallic scent of thunder. On such days the city feels ancient, wrapped in memory. Raindrops tap like impatient customers against the shutters. The girl sits cross-legged behind the counter, trimming a piece of calfskin. The knife slips. A thin line of blood beads along her finger. Her father looks up sharply, tears a strip of paper from a ledger margin and wraps it around the cut. "Books can wound too. Remember that," he says gently. She studies the blood darkening the paper, thinking it beautiful in its own way, like ink flowing where it shouldn't. Weeks blend together. Life measures itself in deliveries of paper, in the slow wearing of broom bristles, in the number of candles used before the next market day. The girl grows in quiet sympathy with the objects around her. She listens to the creak of bindings as others listen to voices. When her father forgets his spectacles, she reads aloud to him from Dante or Petrarch. The rhythms console her, even when the meaning passes beyond her grasp. There is rest in repetition, in the faith that words, if kept long enough, will understand their keeper. Then comes the illness. It arrives quietly, disguised as stubborn tiredness. He coughs longer, eats less. He insists on working, claiming that routine chases sickness away better than medicine. The girl fetches him broth from the neighbor's kitchen. Pietro, the errand boy, brings herbs boiled in cheap wine. But the cough deepens, echoing through the shelves like a low drum. The child pretends not to notice the smell of vinegar and smoke doctors use to cleanse the air. On the evening his fever climbs, rain returns, steady, persistent. She sits beside his bed, counting breaths instead of minutes. Outside, a lantern sways in the wind, sending long tremors of light across the walls. He reaches for her hand, his fingers cool and dry. "Keep the shop open," he whispers. "There's honesty in work. People forget that. She nods through tears, unable to find words strong enough to hold what he gives her then. Not advice, but faith. By dawn the next day, silence fills the bookshop like mist. It is not the silence of closing time full of rest, but the stillness that follows finality. She watches the first light touch the shelves and thinks that even grief smells faintly of paper and glue. Pietro helps fetch the priest. Neighbors arrive with candles. Someone touches her shoulder and tells her she is brave. She does not feel brave. She feels folded shut, like a book returned to the shelf too soon. Days stretch hollowly after the funeral. The landlord knocks, murmuring about rent. She bows her head, hearing her father's words about dignity, and answers carefully that she will pay as promised. Each evening she polishes the brass knob of the door, though no customers come. She starts reading again, not to learn, but to fill the air with sound. Once, while rearranging the front window, she finds a note her father had hidden under a stack of invoices. Knowledge survives hands, not names. She presses it to her forehead before placing it among the accounting ledgers, where memory and duty may coexist. Spring returns slowly. The Arno reflects softer skies. Market sellers sing again. The girl takes comfort in the rebuilding of patterns, the sweep of the broom, the knotting of thread, the steady reopening of shutters each morning. She begins to find small joy in these repetitions, like someone mending the fabric of days, stitch by careful stitch. Her laughter surfaces now and then, usually at herself, when paste drips onto her sleeve or a passing cat knocks over the inkwell. From time to time, she dreams of her father walking through the shop, straightening books, turning one toward the light. He never speaks in these dreams, but the silence feels peaceful, not empty. And when she wakes, she thinks that perhaps even in the quiet corners of the world, meaning does not die. It only waits for someone patient enough to keep reading. Afternoons in Florence often arrive quietly, like guests removing their shoes before stepping inside. The sun softens on the rooftops, and market noise sinks into a drowsy hum. In the old bookshop near the river, the air hangs thick with parchment dust. Shelves sag slightly under the weight of centuries. The ink smell has long mingled with the scent of oil, ash, and patience. The young woman who tends the shop now, her father's daughter, moves between the rows as one might through a prayer, each gesture learned by repetition rather than thought. The door's bell no longer turns many heads. Books have grown unfashionable among those with coin. Men of leisure collect porcelain figurines or mechanical toys imported from France. Still, she keeps the door open, because closing it feels like surrender. Her hair is tied loosely, her apron patched. The ledger on the counter shows pages more yellow than white, the fading sums of days when her father still breathed. Sometimes she traces those numbers as if his hand might be trapped beneath them. This morning she balanced the accounts again, rewriting the same arithmetic that never improves. The rent takes almost all profit, leaving only a few coins for bread, candles, and paper paste. Yet her fingers remain steady. Work, even hopeless work, keeps the mind upright. When fatigue creeps in, she sits by the window that overlooks the lane and listens to the city breathe. Florence, though poorer now, still holds its rhythm. The faint clang of a smith's hammer, the cry of a washerwoman, the murmured bargaining over olives. On the corner, beggars cough under damp sacks. Horses stamp impatiently at carts heaped with firewood. The girl observes everything without judgment, her caution toward strangers forming part of her armor. Around those in power, she becomes almost invisible, bowing her head, choosing silence when pride might draw notice. She has learned this discretion early. Those who talk too much in a city governed by changing hands soon find themselves without customers. Yet among her few friends, her tongue loosens. She teases Pietro, no longer a boy, now a delivery clerk with a quick grin, about his clumsy speech and uncombed hair. He laughs and calls her maestra, half in jest, half in awe. Naldo visits too, though less predictably. He is older than she, round-faced and loud, wearing the faint perfume of someone who spends too much time in cafes discussing politics he cannot afford to influence. He claims to know collectors, buyers, even minor officials, and promises to bring her rare orders that might save the shop. Sometimes he does. More often, he does not. Yet when he lands heavily in the chair by her counter, brushing off rain with mock dignity, she cannot help smiling. His stories, like mediocre wine, warm briefly before the ache returns. Behind the laughter lies a friendship built on unequal trust. She knows he takes small favors, coins lent, errands done, letters sent in her name. But she forgives easily. It feels simpler than anger, and forgiveness costs her nothing but time, which she has plenty of. Work fills the space between visitors. The girl cleans bindings with vinegar, presses crumpled maps flat under heavy glass, threads new spines through brittle leather. Sometimes her mind drifts to the rhythm of these motions, thinking of her father's saying, "Honesty in work is a form of prayer." She wonders if faith may survive even when one no longer prays aloud. Perhaps it lives in the care placed upon small things, sewing straight seams, counting the coins twice, dusting each shelf though no one will notice. One afternoon, an elderly priest enters, smelling of incense and damp wool. He requests a missal once printed for a monastery that closed before she was born. She searches for it patiently, kneeling to lift boxes from the lowest shelf, her skirt brushing the floor. Her hands return coated in fine dust, her knees sore, but she finds a similar copy. The priest eyes her modest shop and mutters that knowledge grows weeds when left uncared for. His tone carries pity rather than reproach. She thanks him anyway and does not charge extra. That night, Florence hums with restless wind. From the open window, she watches lamps flicker along the Arno, their reflections trembling like half-remembered dreams. Her fingers smell of wax and parchment. For a while, she imagines herself far from here, in Siena perhaps, or Venice, selling not books, but stories she could tell by heart. She would describe the color of old bindings as shades of memory, ochre for regret, gray for endurance. Yet such thoughts dissolve quickly. Dreams, to her, are small luxuries that cannot be left unattended. Someone might steal them while she sleeps. Winter approaches again. Prices rise, coins fall faster from her purse. Still, she refuses to close the shop. Some evenings, she swaps one candle for another before it burns out, tricking light into lasting longer. A small act of defiance, of humor even. Once, when Naldo remarks that she should marry a grocer and leave dust to bachelors, She laughs, not cruelly, but with weary amusement. There is safety in solitude, if not comfort. Early one morning, she receives a letter sealed with green wax. The handwriting is unfamiliar, angular, expensive. It is from a minor noble family requesting an appraisal of their library, which they intend to sell to pay debts. The fee, though modest, promises a month's living. She folds the letter carefully into her apron and whispers a short thanks to no one in particular. That evening she walks across the city, through narrow alleys still slick from rain, to the family's palazzo. Inside, the air smells of mildew masked with rosewater. The attendant leads her through grand rooms where portraits regard her with indifferent eyes. The library itself stands neglected, its shelves gaping where books were already sold. She spends hours bent over each volume, noting titles, sniffing bindings for signs of mold, estimating worth. The Countess, pale and soft-spoken, watches from a chair near the window, speaking only once, that a lifetime of reading leaves few useful riches. The young woman answers quietly, "Paper keeps its shape longer than memory." The Countess smiles faintly, perhaps understanding, perhaps not. Back at her shop, she copies her notes by candlelight. The wax drips onto the ledger, forming small amber domes like frozen tears. She misses her father most at such times, when duty outweighs hope, and someone must still tidy the accounts. Yet amid the fatigue grows a small relief. She is managing. Survival, though modest, feels almost like gratitude. Weeks flow uneventfully after that. Pietro brings gossip from the street, whispers of new taxes, a quarrel between officials and priests, rumors of famine in nearby provinces. Florence holds its breath, cautious under shifting rulers. For her, politics remains distant thunder. She nods, listens, and counts her inventory twice. Still, she senses something changing. Buyers bargain harder, speaking of hard times to come. At night, the lamps burn dimmer along the river. One rainy evening, Naldo appears again, eyes bright with schemes. He insists that people of influence now hunger for rare books linked to ancient sciences, matters the church once forbade. He says collectors will pay fortunes for any trace of such volumes. She listens politely, hiding her amusement behind folded hands. The world has always chased forbidden knowledge, mostly to boast they have glimpsed it, not to understand. "Let them chase," she says. "My shelves hold nothing worth dying for." Naldo grins and replies that she underestimates the appetite of the wealthy. Then he leaves, taking more warmth than the fire left behind. That night she cannot sleep. The rain beats against the shutters, and the room smells of damp paper. She sits at her counter, paging through her father's old notes. Some margins carry cryptic marks, dates, initials, half-legible receipts. Among them, she finds a sketch of the shop's layout, with faint letters written across the lower wall. Cellar inventory. She smiles at the memory of her father crawling under the floorboards to rescue moldy tomes from floods. Perhaps those boxes still lie untouched beneath layers of dust. The thought brings a strange comfort, a sense of connection through labor left unfinished. She decides she will clean the cellar when spring returns, once the frost no longer cracks the hinges. For now, she closes the ledger, breathes in the smell of ink, and watches dawn creep through the window. Outside, Florence stirs again. The first cries of street vendors echo down the cobblestones. Smoke rises from nearby chimneys, painting thin gray letters against the pale sky. She lights the stove, warms her hands, and whispers good morning to the shelves. The city may not answer, but the books do. Quietly, through the rustle of their pages, sound enough to remind her that even forgotten voices endure when someone listens. Florence woke that spring to the sound of rainwater murmuring through drains and gutters. The light, though pale, carried a warmth that promised renewal. Market sellers unfolded their awnings again, and the smell of oranges returned to the air. Yet inside the bookshop on the narrow street by the Arno, another kind of awakening stirred, quiet, hesitant, and older than the season itself. For weeks she had noticed the floorboards by the back shelves bow slightly, as though hiding their own secrets. A trace of mildew had crept up the wall, and she was determined to clean it before the damp ate through paper and binding alike. One morning, tying her apron higher, she fetched a lantern and descended into the cellar her father had once kept locked. The key had hung for years behind the counter, gathering oxidized dust. It turned stiffly now, as if reluctant to betray what it guarded. The air below smelled of stone and salt. The walls bled moisture, and old crates lined the corners. She moved slowly, brushing cobwebs with a broom handle, her breath making small clouds in the lantern glow. Most boxes held nothing of value. Bundles of invoices, torn atlases, forgotten school editions. Then, beneath a collapsed stack of folios, her hand met leather, cold, rough, different. It was a book unlike the rest, larger, bound in pale vellum darkened by age, cornered with strips of copper, too finely worked for trade editions. No title nor author graced its spine. The binding seemed tightened by threads of a darker hue, as if mended long ago with intent to last longer than law or ownership. Dust lifted off it like mist disturbed from water. She brought it upstairs, setting it gently on the counter as though it might bruise under sudden light. The cover bore faint markings, geometric figures, circles intersected with letters written backward, inscriptions only half legible. She frowned, tracing one of them with her fingertip. The script resembled Latin, disfigured by mirror reflection. Between the lines of the parchment ran tiny, deliberate dots of ink, forming constellations. Her curiosity wrestled with caution, but curiosity, as always, won the first round. The first pages were a dialogue, two voices debating whether divine truth could exist apart from human perception. Their tone was not humble but daring, almost mocking the accepted theology of the time. Margins carried notes in another hand, a later scholar perhaps, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes expanding the argument. She closed the book slowly. It had the stillness of something waiting to be found. At first she thought little of it beyond scholarly value. If the writing was as old as it appeared, selling even a copy could mend her finances for months. She recalled Naldo's rambling about forbidden texts, words rich people pretended to fear, while secretly paying to touch their danger. It seemed absurd, but also convenient. She placed the book beneath a linen cloth inside the counter drawer, and told herself to forget it until she had time to study its worth. Yet forgetting proved difficult. When closing the shop at night, she felt drawn to lift the cloth again. Each time she did, the symbols appeared to shift, under candlelight, or perhaps her eyes imagined motion in the dimness. She began to dream of strange maps, luminous on black paper, or of voices reciting phrases without sound. The dreams were not frightening, only persistent, leaving her waking with a faint ache as after reading too long by poor light. A week passed before anyone came asking unusual questions. The man appeared just after dusk, wearing travel clothes splattered with road dust. He called himself a scholar from the north, his accent uncertainly foreign.
He spoke softly, avoiding her eyes, and claimed to be searching for a manuscript described in an old estate inventory. No title given, only a note about the Florentine dialogue. When she hesitated, he smiled in a tired way, offering to pay generously for any clue. She measured his politeness as one measures dangerous weather, by tension in the air rather than words. Ethics wrestled with livelihood. She promised only to check her inventory and asked him to return in 3 days. He bowed, thanked her, and vanished into the rain. The bell over the door stilled, yet its ring seemed to linger too long. The following evening brought unease she could not rationalize. Twice she heard steps in the alley, though none passed the window. Once, while fetching firewood, she found the lock on the cellar door scratched, as if tested by unfamiliar hands. Her neighbors knew better than to meddle with one another's property. The air of secrecy around books could repel even the curious. Still, the sense of being watched clung to her. She carried the vellum book to her small living room and hid it behind a false panel at the bottom of her writing desk, one her father had built to conceal unpaid ledgers during hard times. Then, uneasy but determined, she returned to her routine. The shop must open each morning. Dust must be swept, candles trimmed. Work remained her defense against intrusion. On the 3rd day the man returned, precisely as promised. His cloak was still damp, but his politeness seemed rehearsed now, brittle around the edges. He brought with him an envelope, unsmoothed by travel, containing a down payment more than she earned in a month. "Even to learn if the book exists," he said quietly. "Not to buy." She asked his name. He smiled again. "In study, names distract." A scholar's joke, perhaps, yet it chilled her nonetheless. He left shortly after, declining to browse, leaving the scent of rain and tobacco behind. She stood at the door long after his steps faded. Pietro arrived later, carrying vegetables, and found her still staring down the street. He teased her gently, asking whose carriage had stopped by. She waved him off with a laugh, too quick to be natural. That night no dreams came, but she woke repeatedly, convinced she heard pages turning across the room. The book remained hidden, yet its presence seemed to hum through the furniture, as though every object remembered its outline. Morning brought distraction in the form of a police messenger, delivering a routine notice about thieves stealing from small traders. Nothing extraordinary for Florence. Still, she read it twice. Later, when walking to the marketplace, she glimpsed the same foreign scholar in the crowd near Ponte Vecchio. He was not alone now. 2 men shadowed him, dressed as clerks. But it was the smallest detail that unsettled her most. A torn seam near his glove, revealing a ring etched with a stylized flame. The image nagged at memory. She had seen it somewhere before, perhaps on a binding decoration, or one of her father's old catalogs. That evening, she searched the shop's records and found it inked faintly on a set of invoices dated decades earlier, beside a symbol, Fraternitas Lucis. Her father's note beside it read only, "Paid in full, never again." The words blurred under her breath. Her father had always been cautious about secrecy. He once told her that true danger hides under the language of enlightenment. She ran her fingers over the ink, then looked toward the hidden panel where the vellum volume rested. In the silence of the shop, faintly illuminated by the street lamp outside, she understood that her father had guarded something more than unpaid bills. Days slipped past in anxious quiet. No sign of the visitor, yet the sense of pursuit thickened. Books arrived from estates as usual, yet she handled them distractedly, glancing often toward the window. Once she caught sight of Naldo speaking with a stranger near the market arch. They parted too quickly at the sight of her. When asked later, Naldo dismissed it. Just a courier asking directions. But his cheer felt brittle, his eyes avoiding hers. Toward the end of that week, the foreign scholar's disappearance spread through whispers. Lodgings found abandoned, door left open, papers gone. Some claimed he sailed toward Livorno, others that the police had taken him. Pietro brought the gossip eagerly, but the young woman said little. She only locked the shop earlier that night. When darkness fell fully, thunder rolled over the city. She lit a single candle and placed the vellum book on her table again. Touching it, she felt the same weightless vertigo as before, of time folding, of ideas passing like tides. On the first page, under the ink's fragile shine, she now saw something she had missed before. A faint line in Italian written in her father's hand, barely visible under the earlier script. It read, "Truth does not burn, only those who hold it too tightly." The candle flickered. The rain outside thickened into a muffled drum. She closed the manuscript and held it to her chest, not with reverence, but with resolve. Whatever its history, whatever dangers it carried, it had belonged to her father once, and perhaps through him, to something greater than fear. Above her, the ceiling creaked with the weight of wind, and from somewhere far beyond the wall came the soft echo of footsteps fading into night. Florence slept under its thin blanket of rain, unaware that, in a small shop by the river, a story centuries old had opened its eyes once more. The heat arrived early that year, pressing over Florence like a heavy hand. Cobblestones shimmered under the noon glare, and even the river moved slower, unwilling to glisten. Inside the bookshop, the air was still. Each turn of a page lifted only a sigh of stale dust. The woman moved slower too. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, the thin sheen of work and sleeplessness on her skin. The lantern on the counter had burned shorter than before. Since the foreign scholar's disappearance, an invisible thread seemed to tie her to the silence outside. Each noise grew meaningful, the scrape of carriage wheels, the sigh of someone passing too near the door. Neighbors said thieves roamed the river quarter again, searching for valuables in warehouses, gold in cellars. She nodded, pretending agreement, yet she sensed these were not simple mouths of hunger prowling the night. Sometimes she caught herself listening for the sound of footsteps stopping outside the shop. It was always her imagination, she said aloud, until one morning she found the latch on the window slightly open, though she remembered locking it. The air inside held another scent, musky, foreign, as if someone had brought in the night itself and left it folded among her books. Still, nothing was missing. Even the old coins in the till remained untouched. 2 weeks passed. The unease did not. One afternoon, as sunlight slipped through the shutters in bars, she noticed a book slightly ajar on the shelf behind the counter. She distinctly remembered closing all volumes that morning. Habit ruled her like breathing. She pulled it free, the spine stiff, the edges clean. and found between its pages a speck of wax, red and cold. Someone had opened it recently, perhaps to hide something. She turned the pages and saw nothing, only a faint indentation near the center, as though a folded note had once lain there. That night she did not light the stove. Florence was hot even at dusk.
The alleys murmured with accordion tunes drifting from taverns, and beyond them, the half-seen towers glowed in the distance, like patient sentries. She sat near the little window above the workbench, the manuscript hidden as always in the secret compartment. Her eyes followed a candle flame trembling in the corner of a mirror. She spoke softly, the first time in days. "Father, what did you guard here?" The mirror answered only with silence. Work remained her defense. Customers continued to come and go, students, priests, petty officials. Yet patterns emerged among them. One young man, with clean cuffs and a nervous smile, returned thrice in a week, always asking about books on ancient heresies. His questions grew cautious only when she mentioned the foreign scholar. Another client, a woman draped in silver-gray shawls, requested a catalogue of lost dialogues, but refused to write her address. Each left behind the faint trace of watchfulness, as though measuring her. At twilight one evening, she saw Naldo again after weeks of absence. His coat smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. He appeared thinner, his laughter flattened by fatigue. She served him wine from the small flask she kept for rare company, and for a while they spoke of ordinary things. Streets flooded near Mercato Vecchio, rumors of plague upriver, the new taxes strangling trade. But when she mentioned the missing scholar, his hand tightened on the glass. "People disappear in Florence all the time," he said lightly. "Gold changes hands. Secrets travel faster than tongues. Best to stay quiet." She studied him. His eyes did not meet hers, instead wandering toward the shuttered windows, as though rehearsing an exit. She asked if he had heard of any brotherhoods calling themselves the Fraternitas Lucis. The name made him flinch before he forced a laugh. "Superstition, my dear. Old fools mixing philosophy with shadows." When he left, she knew he had lied. For several days after, she avoided reopening the hidden drawer. Some instinct told her that every movement was marked by unseen eyes. Then, late one evening, when the city's noise had softened into that timid hush before curfew, the bell of the shop door gave a timid ring. A figure stepped through, hood drawn low, habit rough. The stranger smelled of travel, dust, and parchment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the rhythm of sermon and confession. "Forgive my lateness, child. I am Brother Ambrogio." His face emerged under the dim light, a scholar's austerity softened by something resembling melancholy. He said he had known her father long ago, that both shared an interest in preserving certain manuscripts at risk of disappearance. He had heard whispers that a book once entrusted to her father had resurfaced. His tone was cautious, not greedy. Yet beneath his gentleness, one felt the gravity of someone walking on dangerous ground. She asked carefully what kind of manuscript he meant. The monk's eyes drifted to the walls as if expecting them to listen. "An old dialogue. Philosophers once debated it under threat of an inquisitor's flame. Some claimed it led readers to question divine will itself.
He folded his hands. Such thoughts do not die easily. Those who once burned them now seek to erase their traces entirely. A draft shivered through the shop. She watched the small flame of her lamp tilt, imagining for a moment that light itself recoiled from what was said. "If those men wish to erase words, why search among my shelves?" she whispered. "Because your father refused to give them up." His reply dropped between them like a pebble into still water. Brother Ambrogio left soon after. No threats, no requests, no payment offered. Only a blessing murmured at the door and the rustle of sandals fading into the alley. When she looked out moments later, the lane was empty. From that night, the shop felt changed. Every board now seemed to creak in conversation with another place. Every flicker of the lamp suggested something waiting to be read. She worked later than usual, visiting the shelves one by one, restacking, straightening, checking that spines aligned neatly. Routine cloaked her uneasy mind. Only near dawn, when fatigue blurred thought, did she lift the panel under her desk and draw out the manuscript once more. The vellum felt warmer than before. By candlelight, she studied its penmanship, the looping script that alternated between clarity and cipher. Marginal notes bloomed in redder ink toward the middle, like wind-blown petals. Beside one intricate diagram of a burning sun, she saw a tiny phrase, "The lamp within the stone." At the bottom, corners bore prints faintly smudged, as if someone once read it quickly, perhaps in fear. She thought again of her father writing, "Truth does not burn, only those who hold it too tightly." Outside, bells announced the hour of early prayers. She closed the volume, wrapped it again, and returned it to its hollow refuge. Through the shutters slid the first light, painting the dust motes gold. The moment was too calm, almost deliberate. She sensed that calm, like the silence before thunder. By midday, the first echo of disturbance arrived. Pietro burst through the door, face flushed from running. He carried news. Officials had searched several merchants' houses along the river, collecting forbidden writings and questioning anyone dealing in theological curiosities. He urged her to hide anything suspicious. She smiled faintly, habit again, and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Do not worry, Pietro," she said. "I sell only what the world has already forgotten." But once he left, her composure faltered. She paced the narrow aisles, every sound amplified, the ticking of the wall clock, the scrape of her steps. Something within urged her to destroy the manuscript, or at least to pass it away into safer hands. Yet another impulse, quiet but firm, told her that the book did not belong to fear anymore. Knowledge, like a child once abandoned, required courage simply to let it live. As daylight thickened toward evening, she decided. The next day, she would visit the monastery beyond Porta San Nicolo. She would find Brother Ambrogio and place the manuscript where prayer might guard it better than walls. That thought steadied her. She slept for the first time in weeks with the window open, the river murmuring below, the city stretched in silence, unaware that in one small bookshop, an old story, once condemned, was preparing to breathe again. The morning began with the smell of smoke in the distance. It carried the faint bitterness of burned wood mixed with wet straw, drifting from the lower streets where workshops lined the river. The woman paused over her kettle and listened. Somewhere, a bell tolled unevenly, not for prayer, but for warning. Florence had grown restless again.
Whispers of searches and arrests bent around every corner, finding their way even into her quiet lane. The authorities declared they were protecting the city from foreign conspiracies. But in markets and taverns, the word heresy murmured anew, like an old ghost returned to claim unpaid debts. Her shop remained calm only in appearance. Behind the counter, the secret compartment still held the forbidden manuscript, now wrapped in thicker cloth and bound with a belt of leather. She had meant to deliver it to Brother Ambrogio's monastery, yet each dawn brought either new fear or new doubt. The last time she ventured near Porta San Niccolò, 2 armed officers inspected passers-by, asking names and business. She turned back before they reached her, pretending to have forgotten her purse. Caution had become her second skin. Still, life demanded its motions. Customers arrived for minor purchases, ink, hymnals, blank ledgers. Pietro stopped by often, his concern hidden under cheerful errands. Once he mentioned that Naldo had not been seen for several days. The remark left her uneasy. She had come to rely on certain details of the ordinary world, knowing where Naldo drank, when Pietro delivered flour, how long the bell of Santa Croce took to fade. Each small certainty stood between her and the chaos she felt growing beyond the door. That evening, as daylight dimmed to amber, she sat mending a binding at her desk. The storm predicted since morning finally broke, shaking loose rain thick as spilled ink. She stood to close the shutters. When she turned back, the candle flame along the counter shook once, as if from a passing breeze, and went still. Something clicked softly in the rear corridor, the faint metallic sound of the cellar latch shifting. She froze. No one had been allowed into the back rooms since her father's death. The door stood closed, yet a thin draft touched her neck. Slowly she crossed the room, lifted the lamp, and pressed her ear to the wood. There was no sound except the patter of rain. Telling herself it was the wind, she slid the bolt in place and returned to her chair. But all evening, her eyes kept straying to that door. Near midnight, she gave up pretending to work. The lamp burned low, leaving shadows climbing higher up the walls. She rose, fetched another candle, and lifted the wooden bar from the cellar entrance. The darkness inside was dense, holding the smell of paper and damp chalk. She took one step down, the flame trembling in her hand. There was nothing. No intruder, no movement, only the echo of her own breathing. Then, as she turned to climb back, her light caught upon the floor. Faint footprints in the dust, broader than her own, fresh enough to glisten. By morning, she had rechecked every lock, every shutter. The footprints had already softened overnight, blurring into the pattern of the stone. Whoever entered had taken nothing, or perhaps had been seeking only one specific thing they failed to find. She told herself she imagined the rest, yet unease knotted her like thread pulled too tight. She decided then that the book could no longer remain in her care. Toward dusk, she left that resolution half-spoken in a note for Pietro. Should any misfortune occur, he was to sell what remained of the shop and keep the proceeds. Then she wrapped the manuscript and placed it in a plain satchel, covering it with a scattering of unrelated papers and rag bindings. Dressed in her coarsest cloak, she stepped into the narrow street just as the sky dimmed to purple. The rain had cleared. Lamps burned near every archway, their reflections jittering on puddles. She kept to the quieter lanes, crossing bridges when they emptied of traffic. A chill wind rose from the river, carrying the scent of wet stone and wine stores.
The monastery's bell tower was visible in the distance, one faint triangle of light against the sky. She was nearly there when she heard her own name called softly behind her. It was Naldo. His hat dripped rain, his expression unreadable. He stood half in shadow, his shoulders hunched as though burdened. She hesitated, torn between relief and suspicion. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You should not be out alone with that bag," he said. "How do you know what I carry?" He gestured faintly toward her satchel, then toward the dark street. "They know, too." The words chilled her more than the air. "Who?" "Those who came asking for the foreigner," he said quickly. "I told them nothing. But one followed me, thinking I would lead them to you. They're not men of study. They want a book burned or hidden in some courtier's chest where no priest dares look." She tightened her hold on the strap. His eyes darted past her to the river's curve. Thunder rolled far off. "What must I do?" she asked. He took a step nearer. "Trust me," he whispered. "Give it to me. I can—" A sudden movement at the end of the street cut him short. Two figures had emerged from an archway, walking toward them with even pace. Naldo's face shifted. Fear twisted through his features. "Go!" he hissed. "Now!" Before she could reply, he shoved a folded paper into her hand and turned to meet the newcomers with forced cheer. She hesitated only a moment, then fled toward the side alley that slanted uphill behind the tannery. The path was narrow, littered with refuse, the walls wet against her shoulder. Behind her came voices, civil at first, then rising. One laugh rang false in the night. By the time she reached the small plaza above the river bend, her lungs burned. She crouched beneath the overhang of a stone stairway, waiting. The street below lay empty, only the hiss of rain on tiles. She drew the satchel tighter under her cloak and crept back toward the monastery district, knowing she would not reach its gates before curfew. Finding an abandoned workshop near the dyer's quarter, she slipped inside and bolted the door. The room smelled of vinegar and rust, the remnants of long-gone labor. She struck flint for a spark, but let it die. Darkness felt safer. For a time she heard nothing but the slow beat of water dripping through the roof. Then, faintly, footsteps outside again, deliberate, stopping near her door, then retreating. The hours until dawn stretched endlessly. When the gray light came, she ventured out. The city was nearly calm, washed clean by rain. The alley where she'd left Naldo was deserted, save for a splash of dried mud and a broken chain on the ground. The faces she passed looked ordinary. Bakers opening stalls, a woman scolding a child, a man drawing water. Yet everything seemed staged, like the pause before another act began. Back inside the shop, exhaustion dropped her into a chair. She remembered Naldo's crumpled note still in her pocket. Opening it carefully, she found no message at all, only a small drawing of the same symbol she had once seen on the foreign scholar's ring. The stylized flame. Beneath it, one word written hastily, East. She folded the paper and placed it with the manuscript. Anger mingled with grief. Had Naldo betrayed her or warned her? Perhaps both. The simplest truths often refused single shapes. Toward evening, a knock sounded, firm, official. Through the glass, she saw a constable in uniform flanked by another man in plain clothes. They requested to search her shop, citing a complaint of stolen property belonging to a traveling scholar, presumed dead. Her hands steadied by habit, she granted permission. They moved efficiently, checking shelves and drawers, but not the floor beneath her desk. After an hour, they left, apologizing for the intrusion. When the door closed, she locked it quickly and let herself breathe. No peace came.
She knew it was only a matter of time before the search returned with less courtesy. That night, she wrapped the manuscript once more, sealing it against moisture, and hid it beneath a loose plank behind the fireplace. Not even fire itself, she thought, should touch it until she had understood the length of her father's silence. Outside, the smell of smoke returned on the wind, heavier now, as if the city burned its secrets one street at a time. She stood at the window, her reflection ghosted by candlelight, and realized that Florence had changed its face. Every pilgrim, clerk, and beggar could be watching for something written long ago, something they feared to read. She closed the shutters carefully, one by one, and turned the lock on the door. Behind her, a faint scratching came from the hearth, perhaps a mouse, perhaps the sound of settling embers. It was impossible to tell. The city exhaled, the rain began again, and another night fell over both the innocent and the hunted alike. The river had turned the color of pewter, sluggish and swollen from autumn rain. Florence slept fitfully under clouds that smelled of iron, its towers fading into mist. Somewhere near Porto San Nicolo, a bell struck once, long and uncertain, before falling into the steady whisper of water. Inside the small bookshop by the Arno, the woman packed by candlelight. Each item she touched seemed to protest. A worn brush, a brass weight, the quill her father once balanced behind his ear. The shelves stood stripped, their emptiness multiplied by silence. She did not intend to flee the city, only to see Brother Ambrogio, to finally place the manuscript where it might survive without her. The meaning of Naldo's last message, east, remained her only compass. But to move through Florence now was to walk through rumor. The scholar's disappearance had become a parable whispered in markets. Some claimed he had discovered forbidden truths, others that the church itself silenced him for his arrogance. Patrols had multiplied. The constables preferred booksellers and printers for their searches. Too many rebellions had begun with ink. Her own name, she feared, might soon join one of their lists. Before leaving, she knelt by the hearth where she had hidden the vellum volume. The panel lifted with a small groan. The manuscript lay untouched, bound in leather and cloth, the faint pattern of the stylized flame pressing through. Her hand trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. Outside her window, the drizzle fixed itself into a rhythm like slow breathing. The city at dawn had the color of old coins. She set off along the footpaths, the book concealed beneath her cloak. In the deserted Piazza Santa Croce, the market stalls still dripped from rain, pigeons gathered by the fountain, gray on gray. Each step echoed sharply against stone, and she worried the sound would draw notice. Near the old walls, she passed a tinker tightening his wagon ropes. He raised his hat respectfully, no question in his eyes. For a moment, she envied his ignorance. By late morning, the gate of the monastery appeared through the fog. Its walls rose plain and grave, built from sandstone darkened by years of weather. She hesitated before knocking. The door opened without touch, as though expecting her, revealing Brother Ambrogio's familiar figure. His face looked older now, marked by sleeplessness, but gentle all the same. "I thought you might come," he said, stepping aside.
The monastery smelled of candle soot and herbs. Their steps ghosted across the stone corridor as they moved toward the cloister garden, where the air felt damp and clean. He motioned for her to sit beneath the arch. "You've brought it," he said quietly, not asking, but knowing. She nodded, laying the manuscript on the bench between them.
For a long time they both stared at it, the silence filled only by the drip of rain from the eaves. When he finally spoke, his tone carried both reverence and regret. This book was written by a circle of scholars who believed reason was a form of faith. It cost some their lives. Others vanished into anonymity, surviving only through aliases and apprentices. Your father was one of the last to preserve their work. He kept a copy even after it was forbidden again. Her fingers clenched around the edge of her cloak. He knew what it was? He knew it could be used for good or destruction, depending on who read it, the monk replied. He hid it until danger passed, but danger never passes entirely. They sat in the hush of dripping rain. The air carried the faint scent of rosemary from the garden. Through the grills came the muffled chanting of monks at prayer, steady, timeless, like the sound of breathing itself. The woman watched the droplets run over the book's cover, tracing the copper fittings like veins of fire. "I am tired of being afraid," she said quietly. Ambrosio looked at her, the kind of gaze that searches and forgives in the same motion. Fear is what keeps faith close to honesty. But fear can be shaped into courage if you do not let it choose for you. He lifted the manuscript gently. "Leave it here. The library vault is sealed except by our abbot's hand. You will not be questioned again." The relief she expected did not come. Instead, a strange emptiness rose, a separation not from danger, but from purpose. For the first time she realized that her life's weight had gathered behind protecting this small thing, and by giving it away, she would walk lighter, yet lonelier. Still, she nodded. "I trust you," she said simply. Trust, she knew, was the most fragile act of faith. Before she left, the monk offered her a folded scrap of parchment. On it was a short passage written in Latin, and beneath it, an Italian translation. "The flame that seeks to devour the stone learns that it, too, depends on the light it gives." She placed it in her pocket, uncertain whether it was advice or farewell. The return journey wound beneath the city's inner walls. Rain had eased, but clouds still pressed low, muting sound and color. Passing along the riverbank, she saw small lanterns flickering atop poles, warnings for ferrymen against the current. One had fallen into the water, still burning as it drifted. She paused to watch it until the flame went out. When she reached her street near evening, the windows of her shop appeared darker than before. A thin curl of smoke rose from a crack near the roofline. Panic cut through her restraint. She ran forward, forcing the door open. The smell met her first. Charred canvas, hot ink, the bitter tang of burned resin. One corner of the shop still smoldered, where papers had been piled deliberately. She doused the embers with the last of the rainwater in her cloak. The rest of the damage lay hidden in silence. Books blackened, bindings twisted, the counter split. Whoever had come knew where to search. The hearth bricks torn aside, ash smeared across the floor. They had expected the manuscript to be there, only its absence spared it from flames. She stood in the center of the ruin until the floor cooled beneath her shoes. No one came to help.
Fear kept neighbors behind their doors. Finally, Pietro appeared, drawn by the smoke, and stared wide-eyed. Together they cleared the smoldered debris. When she told him that nothing of value had been lost, he studied her with hesitant understanding. That night, she stayed at the back room of the apothecary across the square. Sleep evaded her. Every sound pressed against awareness like water against glass. She thought of Naldo, of the scholar, of all the ghosts that seemed to have walked through her quiet years, without leaving footprints, until now. The city outside breathed in slow rhythm, as if weary of its own suspicion. At dawn, she crossed back to what remained of her shop. The air inside carried the faint sweetness of burned glue and leather. She gathered the unscorched fragments, the few books spared, the brass counterweight, her father's old quill now bent at its tip. Each object felt like a survivor. She wished her father could see this ruin and recognize that endurance, not safety, had been their inheritance. Later that day, a messenger arrived at her door. He wore the robe of a monk, but spoke with the ease of someone unbound by cloister. Embers of rain clung to his sleeves. "Brother Ambrosio sends word," he said. "The book is secure. He asks that you not return for some time. There are eyes upon the monastery." She thanked him, though the words felt distant. After he left, she walked to the riverbank opposite the monastery walls. Across the water, in the slanted light of afternoon, a single lantern burned behind a high window, a faint shimmer of gold amid gray stone. It might have been a signal, or perhaps only the steady flame of a monk riding by twilight. She watched until the bell at sunset called the brothers to prayer, and the light within the window went dark. The Arno carried a long reflection of that extinguished glow, rippling it into fragments. Standing there, wet hem dragging against the stones, she felt the first quiet certainty in weeks. Though knowledge could hide or perish, its light always found another shape, another keeper. Night fell again, patient and cool. She turned back toward the city, where new smoke already rose from a distant chimney, and her shadow followed her through the fog, long and calm, moving in rhythm with the heartbeat of the river. Winter arrived without warning. The night winds that once kissed the Arno carried now the bitterness of ash. Across Florence, chimneys smoked constantly, staining the rooftops in shades of gray. In the bookshop that had already burned once, the young woman lived among blackened beams and half-ruined shelves. She no longer dusted them. She let the soot remain as memory. Days passed with the rhythm of a patient rebuilding the smallest pieces of order. She swept ashes into jars, dried the warped bindings near the stove, and mended paper that still carried the faint scent of smoke. The city outside seemed too bright in its despair. Markets filled with soldiers, priests, and strangers who arrived with coins, but eyes that avoided meeting another's. War rumors had begun again, though no one could say whose banners would appear. She rarely spoke to customers now. Her trade had shrunk to school books and account ledgers, yet people still slipped in quietly, some seeking advice, others only silence. Men of learning had become cautious, hiding their names when they bought. Books, once a measure of culture, now carried the weight of guilt. She watched them come and go, each leaving behind the same anxious air, as if literature itself had turned suspect. One evening, just after sundown, a carriage stopped before her door. She heard voices murmuring outside, the horses breathing steam into the cold. Then 3 men entered, 2 in uniform, 1 older, wearing a dark coat. The gray-coated officer showed her a piece of paper bearing an official seal. They were investigating recent subversive exchanges of knowledge between Florence and certain monastic circles. She listened with calm she did not feel. When they demanded entry into her back rooms, she obliged, knowing what they would find. Only the charred remains she had not yet cleared away. The senior man inspected the place with visible disgust, brushing soot from his gloves. He questioned her about the monastery, the missing scholar, and a man named Naldo, apparently found dead near the city walls. The words came like blunt stones: poison, documents, foreign writings. She said little, only that she was a bookseller who kept her trade honest and feared God more than rumor. Her voice neither pleaded nor resisted. After a search that lasted an hour, they left, leaving the smell of damp wool and suspicion. Through the door crack, she saw them climb into the carriage and vanish toward the palace district. Silence returned with a heaviness she had never known. The name Naldo echoed in her chest. He had been many things: unreliable, loud, careless, but not cruel. There was kindness in his foolishness. Perhaps even his final message had been meant to protect her. The thought softened her anger until it became a form of grief. That night, she opened the folded parchment Ambrosio had given her, the phrase about the flame and the stone, and read it by lamplight until the words blurred. She wondered whether knowledge itself was the flame or the stone, and whether people like her father, Naldo, and the scholar had perished not for ideas, but for forgetting to fear them in time. The next morning dawned clear, sharp enough to etch every roof against the pale sky. A messenger arrived carrying a sealed envelope marked with the monastery's insignia. Inside was a note from Ambrosio written in hurried Latin, a request that she meet him by the old river crossing at nightfall. His words hinted at urgency. The time to guard has ended. The time to act begins. She closed her shop early. The streets outside smelled of snow. A frozen mist rose from the riverbanks. She crossed narrow alleys where the lamps swung weakly in the wind, and by the time she reached the crossing, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The water flowed heavy and dark between stone arches. There she saw Ambrosio waiting, his figure half hidden beneath a green cloak. "You should not have come," she whispered when she reached him. "Nor should you," he answered, eyes narrowing. "But what must be done rarely comes at the proper hour." He withdrew a small wrapped bundle from under his cloak, the manuscript, she realized, her heart faltering. "I thought it safe," she said. "So did I," he replied. "Last night the monastery was searched. I took it before they found the vault. By dawn they will learn it is missing. I cannot return to them." Rain began again, thin as thread. They stood under the stone arch of the bridge, while the city bells marked the first hour of curfew. Ambrosio's voice lowered. "It is no longer a matter of secrecy. Whichever faction seeks this, church, noble, or scholar, they all desire what cannot belong to them. Knowledge does not serve possession. That is why it must vanish once more." She understood before he said it. The book must be destroyed. For a moment neither moved. The water below churned sluggishly. She thought of her father, bent over the same pages decades earlier, believing that truth deserved protection, not burial. Her hands shook. "If we burn it," she murmured, "we become the same as those who fear it." Ambrogio smiled faintly. "And if we keep it, we feed their hunger. Sometimes silence preserves better than words." He placed the vellum into her arms. "You must choose. You are not bound by vows as I am." The manuscript felt heavier than its size. She traced the copper corners, the faded ink lines. Within lived voices of men and women who had dared to think beyond what they were told, flawed, brave, foolish perhaps, yet alive. She thought of Naldo's grin, her father's rough hands, even the vanished scholar's intent eyes. Their courage weighed more than the danger itself. At last she shook her head. "No fire tonight." Ambrogio looked at her for a long time, then nodded once. "Then hide it where even faith cannot find it." He stepped back into the fog, vanishing downriver, his shadow melting among the arches. She walked home through streets emptied by curfew. Around her, the city darkened as lamps guttered out one by one. Somewhere, soldiers' boots clicked over wet stones. She hugged the book close beneath her cloak, her breath rising like smoke in the cold. When she reached her shop, she barred the door, kindled what remained of her hearth, and waited until movement returned to her fingers. From beneath a loose board in the floor, she drew the chest that once held her father's trade licenses. Removing them, she placed the manuscript inside, wrapped in oilcloth and lined with the dust of other decades. She sealed the lid with wax, pressing her ring into it, a quiet promise rather than a signature, and slid it back beneath the boards. The act itself brought little comfort. She sat before the fire until the embers dimmed, listening to the night beyond the shutters. The river's low current murmured faintly through the quiet, like breath between words. The ache inside her chest changed shape. It was no longer fear nor sorrow, but a low and steady resignation. When sleep finally took her, she dreamed of pages dissolving into ash, and from those ashes forming small wings, each carrying a letter into the sky. By dawn, the dream faded, but its peace remained. Weeks passed with suspicious calm. No inquiries returned. The officials forgot her name. Winter pressed hard. Markets shrank, candles shortened. But the shop endured, stubborn as its keeper. She did not speak again with Ambrogio, though sometimes, while crossing the bridge, she thought she saw a cloaked figure watching from the far bank. It was enough to know that somewhere, someone else remembered. One gray morning at the turn of spring, she uncovered the charred remains of her father's old ledger among the debris. On its last page, half burned, she recognized his handwriting. In time, what survives is not what is hidden, but what teaches us to care. The words seemed less a statement than a blessing. She copied them carefully onto fresh paper, using ink made from soot and cider. The line wavered slightly, but she smiled at its imperfection. Then, closing the shutters for the night, she noticed how the reflection of her lamp glowed faintly against the dark window pane, like a page of light floating on invisible ink, waiting for the next hand to read it. Spring returned slowly that year, as if Florence had forgotten what warmth meant. Rain washed winter's soot from the faces of the buildings, revealing patches of color beneath all the gray. The river no longer muttered like a sullen witness. It shone bright and forgetful, carrying fragments of driftwood and the smell of new grass. The days lengthened, and for the first time in months, the woman found herself waking without fear of what the light might show. The old bookshop had changed again. Where fire had once eaten walls and shelves, new planks stood rough but solid. The front window, replaced by a glazier from across the alley, still rippled faintly at its edges, betraying each passing figure with gentle distortion. Inside, the air smelled of paper, starch, and glue, the homely scent of restoration. She had learned through quiet persistence that rebuilding did not begin with carpenters, but with patience. Each morning she warmed the paste on the stove and repaired whatever could still bear repair. Pages dried under flat stones, bindings tightened beneath her hands. A population of humble books, school texts, journals, children's fables, slowly repopulated the emptiness. She worked without hurry, measuring each stitch as if binding time itself back into order. On her counter rested a single coin, left deliberately uncollected, a reminder that nothing was ever fully paid. The shop no longer drew scholars, only neighbors. A washerwoman's son learning his letters, a baker seeking parchment for recipes, a clerk returning to purchase ink with shy apologies for unpaid debts. She welcomed them all. People found comfort in her steadiness, as if within those dusted walls they could breathe a simpler air. They came not for rare books now, but for talk, for kindness disguised as trade. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the glass cabinet, older, thin lines near the eyes, the fire's faint scar along her wrist. But she hardly minded. Those marks felt like punctuation rather than flaw, pauses placed by life itself. She smiled at them the way one smiles at old handwriting. The name Naldo reappeared once in gossip. A traveler spoke of a man found months ago near Bologna with the scholar's ring on his finger. The description did not match, and she let the rumor slide past her without comment. Some truths were better left untangled, carried by silence the way rivers carry debris, steadily, without hurry, until the sea sorts them. Brother Ambrosio's fate remained unknown. No letter arrived. But she sometimes glimpsed monks from the Reformed orders passing through the market, and one of them once paused at her stall longer than the others. When he lifted his eyes, she saw a hint of recognition there, though no words passed between them. That was enough. Inside the shop, time smoothed itself into rhythms again. Morning brought work, noon brought a cup of broth by the window, evening brought lamplight brushed gently across the bindings. She had begun to teach Pietro's young sister to read, using scraps of print too damaged for sale. The girl learned quickly, her laughter chiming between the narrow shelves. In that voice, the books seemed to wake from neglect, as if grateful for new company. One afternoon, while clearing the last crate of fire-warped boards from the cellar, she found a page pressed between two scraps of charred leather. Almost illegible, half the ink melted away, but at the bottom survived one fragment of a sentence, too short to name, too stubborn to vanish. The heart repairs what reason abandons. She did not recall writing it, nor her father, nor any of their books. Without thinking, she placed it in a frame and hung it above the counter. It looked less like scripture and more like an instruction on how to live. From then on, she noticed how often customers paused to read it quietly before leaving. Some frowned in thought. Others smiled faintly, as though reminded of something half-remembered. The words seemed to belong to everyone and no one, As seasons turned, the world outside slowly changed. Foreign soldiers left, taking with them their laws and quarrels. The city, tired of violence, turned its mind again to craft. Stonecutters, painters, printers.
The air filled once more with the ring of hammers and the scent of paint oils. Florence was not at peace exactly, but it had grown wise enough to pretend so. Her life followed the same pattern, modest, constant, sufficiently quiet to pass without notice. Yet occasionally, as dusk settled and she prepared to close the shutters, a tremor of memory would rise, the rhythm of distant rain on the cellar steps, the feeling of a forbidden manuscript resting against her chest. She never spoke of it, not even to Pietro. Yet its echo accompanied her like a faint perfume carried on old cloth. Sometimes at night she dreamed she was binding the same book endlessly, threads tightening, pages aligning, though the text kept changing with every turn. In the dream's calm logic, she felt not frustration but joy, the joy of continuity, of craft itself exceeding the purpose of the object. Years left their soft traces. She added a lamp near the window for failing light, and one day replaced the ledger's cover with sturdy hide dyed the color of walnut. The accounts showed small profit, but she no longer chased coin. Value, she found, had turned inward, into quiet mornings, good glue, the first sip of coffee brought by a grateful neighbor. The boy she once taught returned grown, offering her fresh paper he had made himself, a gift wrapped in plain twine. She pressed his hand in thanks, proud, without saying so. Words had done their work. They had moved forward into another generation, unknowing of the peril they had once borne. In late autumn, the river rose again, but gently this time. Mist lay over the water in long white bands, and morning bells echoed with fatigue rather than ceremony. Standing at her doorway, she caught sight of a familiar object among the fishermen's nets on the opposite bank, a small copper clasp glinting in the sun, shaped like the flame once embossed on the lost manuscript. This sight stunned her, like a whisper half heard. She watched until the reflection disappeared beneath a ripple. It might have been chance. It might have been remembrance. She did not search to know. Mystery, she had learned, was not always a threat. Sometimes it was simply the measure of meaning left unsaid. That evening she reopened a notebook she had kept since youth, the blank one her father gave her when she first learned to cut paper edges evenly. Most pages remained untouched, but now she began to write. Not stories, not confessions, but thoughts gathered like loose leaves. Descriptions of smells, street sounds, fragments of overheard talk, reflections on trade and memory. Her words fell quiet and simple, like breaths preserving an unhurried life. At the top of the first page, she wrote one line only: "Florence endures where pages do." Closing the notebook, she blew out the lamp. The shop settled into darkness, filled with the slow ticking of its old clock, the muted creak of wood resting from long labor. Outside, the city exhaled the warm scent of rain-soaked stone. In the silence that followed, she smiled, not at triumph nor at conclusion, but at the ordinary peace of continuance. The faint trace of binding paste lingered in the air, earthy and sweet, as if every book she had ever loved was still whispering nearby, waiting patiently for another pair of hands to turn the next page.